Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for yet another IRENA Insights webinar. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, and I will be your moderator today. Most of you know who IRENA is, but let me give you a quick introduction who we are. We are an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 161 member countries and 22 countries are in the accession process. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generate a lot of valuable insights, and we're constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that's what brings us to our fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program, where we every other week share with you key insights from our latest work or sneak peeks from our upcoming work, and offer you insights into opportunities and trends and best practices and innovative solutions to address various challenges. A small caveat, we aim to keep these webinars short, approximately 30 minutes. So the aim is not to cover everything, but to give you enough to decide whether you want to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentation further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. Today's webinar will be about energy sector subsidies. Our speaker today is Michael Taylor, our expert on renewable energy costs and subsidies. In his presentation, that is based on the IRENA's technical paper, which he co-wrote or wrote, Energy Subsidies, Evolution in the Global Energy Transformation to 2050, he will provide you with key insights on global use subsidy definitions and calculation methods. He will explain how a first ever estimate of total energy sector subsidies will arrive at and outline strength as limitation of the approach. Michael will also present the current level of energy sector subsidies and the trends in total energy subsidies by fuel or source and across sectors, and share views on what needs to be done to facilitate a more robust debate around the reform on energy subsidies. Okay, oops. So his presentation will be approximately 20 minutes long to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over the microphone to Michael, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, today's webinar will be as usually recorded and available together with the presentation slides on IRENA website, webinar website under past webinars. The link to the website will be shared with you also in the follow-up email. You may also download the presentation slides in the handout section. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have any questions for Michael, please send this to us through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring your questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by Michael, but due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. You can use also the chat feature to introduce yourself and talk to other attendees. To be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, and also what else we could cover in our future editions, we would appreciate your feedback. We would like to invite you to complete a short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar on your screen, and the link will be shared with you also in the follow-up email. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, which has been very helpful. And last but not least, and hopefully not the case, but if you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martina, for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here today with you, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are around the world. What I want to do today, as Martina highlighted, is give you a very quick overview of the work that we've done on energy subsidies, cataloguing today's values and looking at how they might evolve in the global energy transformation to 2050. So to put things in context in terms of why we're interested in doing this analysis and what led IRENA to undertake what it was a quite time-consuming and resource-intensive effort. Obviously, you know, energy sector subsidies have actually been quite ubiquitous in the energy sector and have been for decades and almost from the start of the, if you like, modern energy use. And they are also at various times been an important part of domestic policy discussions about the energy sector and its direction. But the reality is that the analysis of subsidies, aside from some notable exceptions, has really taken a global view. It's often been restricted to country or regional level analysis, which obviously fits with the interest of domestic debates, but it leaves a little bit of a gap of our understanding. There have been organisations that have undertaken this work, and we'll talk about that in the webinar. But there is a little bit and a little bit of a gap here that we wanted to fill. And you know, within all of this, there is also an issue, which we'll see again shortly, that there are various estimates based on slightly different definitions that have different boundary conditions and use often quite significantly different accounting methods. And because of this, not only do we have a relative scarcity of estimates, often it's very difficult to make comparisons between countries. So one of the, if you like, value added of this work is trying to put that all in one place. Right. So what are energy sector subsidies? These can arise from deliberate government action to favour a particular energy source or technology. They can be the unintended consequences of policy or be related to market failure. So there's a number of ways in which these subsidies can come into play. At the same time, it's important to remember that you know, subsidies often have a negative connotation, but they will not necessarily be bad per se. A lot depends on why they're and how they are being implemented in the energy sector, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. So in the context, and the other thing that I think is critical in this whole discussion is that also in the context of the Paris Agreement and ecosystems in general, you know, it's important to distinguish between environmentally harmful subsidies on one hand and those that are designed to actually correct or be environmentally friendly. So that's an important distinction that we also want to highlight with this work, which is, you know, perhaps not so prevalent in the discussion globally. So what are energy sector subsidies? Well, economists generally frown on subsidies in competitive markets because they introduce inefficiencies by creating different incentives from what you would expect. And as a result, there are economic losses, efficiency losses that come into play. So, but as I said, subsidies are not necessarily a bad solution to problems or issues of market failure. So in the, you know, in the energy sector, the idealized world of an economist with perfect competition and low barriers to entry and large number of suppliers, you know, subsidies can be hard to justify, but that is not the world we live in. There are a number of market failures in most, if not all, energy sectors around the world. And in that situation, energy subsidies can be a second best policy solution to try and correct for those market failures. So not the perfect solution, but improve economic efficiency with them. And in the energy sector, the two most prevalent failures where we want to see some action, where we have often see subsidies being deployed to improve economic efficiency, and we talk about this a little bit more in the paper if you really want to go into it. But when we have negative externalities, so the unpriced costs from fossil fuel emissions for local pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. But also in the second case, which is very important for renewables, is where there's what what economists refer to as dynamic economies of scale. That is to say that there is a global benefit from the deployment of renewable energy technologies, because that deployment leads to learning, which drives down costs and technology improvements, and it's a virtuous circle. And so subsidies in the early stage to drive down costs in that circumstance can be justified. However, the devil is really in the detail when you start to look at energy subsidies, because there are a number of definitions and calculation methodologies. So one of the things that may be surprising is there's no standardized, systematically applied definition of what an energy sector subsidy is. On the right-hand side here, you can see five organizations and 5 slightly different definitions. You can look at this at your leisure later on in the paper. And there are some important distinctions between each of these. Some of them are based on institutional focus. Others are based on a division of labor, for instance, the IEA and the OECD. But the IMF definition is the only one to explicitly include unpriced externalities. As I said, the IEA focuses on price, while OECD on tax transfers, and they do an effort to combine their results. So that's a little bit understandable. But all of these slightly different definitions, when overlaid with the fact that there are a range of calculation methodologies, which sometimes depend on the emphasis from the policy perspective. So the OECD is interested in advising its members on tax policy. So they have an inventory of actual legislation and specific tax statements. At the same time, the IEA is known for having a lot of data on fossil fuel consumption and prices, and so they use a price gap approach. So it becomes a bit of an issue once you combine this uncertainty around definitions, calculation methodologies, and then also in some cases the boundary conditions. The most notable example is obviously the IMF's inclusion of unpriced externalities, but there are other examples that are a bit more subtle when you dive into the detail, which can also affect the comparability of the results. So all of this is to say is that despite the fact we have relatively few estimates of global subsidy levels, and mostly focused on fossil fuel subsidies, there is a range of results, and it can be a little bit difficult to interpret exactly what this means. The other thing which I think was important for IRENA to do was that the IEA was the only organization that actually had an estimate for renewable energy subsidies. So we wanted to have a look to see how our analysis stacked up against theirs as well. So this is, all of this is built on many cases on a lot of regional or country-specific analysis done by national institutions or regional institutions like the Asian Development Bank, for instance, in Asia. And it's a little bit understandable that there's not so many of these estimates available, because it is quite onerous in terms of data collection. It is a significant undertaking which took us around 18 months to bring to fruition. And even that, as we'll talk about shortly, is actually a partial view, because it's actually very difficult to cost some of these subsidies based on the form they take. So when we look at the energy sector and subsidies in general, it's important to remember that gaps are really the norm, not the exception, and that most estimates you see tend to be underestimates rather than overestimates, because there are just some things that are missing from the calculation. And just to re-emphasize the point that all of these issues around slightly different definitions, calculation methodologies, and boundary conditions matter. Here you have data for Germany, which has on the left-hand side for 2000, this is for the period 2014-16, the German federal government estimate of subsidies to the energy sector, which, fossil fuel sector, which was around 10 billion, 9 billion. Then you have a number of other estimates going up to ODI in Canada, Europe in the middle, sorry, estimate, which is around 40 billion. Greenpeace, by including some other slightly wider definition of subsidies, comes up to about 52. But if you, and then the IMF, as we mentioned earlier, includes unpriced externalities, and you're even higher. So, but if we strip out ODI and Europe's value and add in the IMF's pollution costs, then you get to a figure which is around 99 billion. So a difference of factor of almost 10, 9 to 10 in estimates. So which one's right? It's not very obvious. So what we did was come up with an estimate for all sources for 2017. So not just fossil fuels, renewables, nuclear as well. In terms of fossil fuels, we've drawn on the IEA and OECD data. There's no point reinventing the wheel. They have the most comprehensive data set. What we did was simply combine them in a way which was more, a little bit more meaningful. We made some minor corrections for some country level data that doesn't seem to be included in either source. And it turns out that this is somewhat higher than any individual estimate of global fossil fuels. So we come to a value of around $447 billion US in 2017. You'll be thinking 2017 is a long time ago, but fossil fuel subsidy estimates are actually quite difficult to calculate. You have to wait for a lag in terms of statistics to calculate them and so on. So in fact, when we published earlier this year in April, 2017 estimates were still the norm, except for fossil fuel subsidy estimates. So again, there are gaps that remain, but we come up with a figure of around 447 billion in 2017, which was higher, if you remember, than the earlier table that flashed up where values were around 300 odd billion. So this is a relatively comprehensive estimate. It's not, there are still gaps, as I mentioned. There are lots of things that are difficult to quantify, like voluntary bonds for coal mine remediation, which are never collected, and so on, that costs fall on taxpayers. So this is a starting point, if you like, a minimum value. In terms of renewables, we drew on various national and regional sources to ensure that we were consistent with our member states' reporting. But we also then made sure we were collecting on a comparable basis, given our definition, which hoves closer to the WTO and OECD. And that we came to a value of around US 166 billion, which was somewhat lower than the IEA's estimate at that for 2017. Most of that is coming from the power generation sector, but unfortunately, given the level of detail that the IEA reports in, it wasn't entirely clear the exact drivers for the difference. They probably relate to different estimates from the IEA and ourselves on residential and commercial solar PV, notably in the United States. Again, this should be considered a minimum kind of estimate. There are some support avenues that we miss. Notably, in the United States, we don't have a complete view of the state level support and the cost of that. But you know, that is what we were able to come to. There's obviously room for improvement. So significantly lower than fossil fuels, despite the fact that renewables are just picking up speed. Now, here we've been talking about what are the direct subsidies. So we're talking about tax transfers, you know, if you like, the premium for a feed-in tariff over the wholesale price or residential tariff. And so when we combine, I haven't talked about nuclear. There's actually no global estimate of subsidies to the nuclear. What we did was take some analysis that was done for the United States, took the minimum value for that on a per kilowatt hour value, and have applied that to global nuclear production in 2017. So that is, if you like, it's simply a placeholder, it's a minimum value. But when we do that, we come to 634 US dollars billion in 2017, which, as I said, is probably a minimum. But this is dwarfed by these indirect subsidies, or the unpriced value of the externalities from fossil fuel combustion. Interestingly, most of that comes from air pollution. These are central values. These span a very wide range, and we'll see that on the final slide in this presentation. So what's quite staggering here is that the direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuels are almost 20 times higher than to renewable energy. So there is quite a significant mismatch. In terms, subsidies, I work on cost metrics to understand the evolution of cost and competitiveness of renewable technologies. Subsidy is another metric we can look at to see how the energy system transformation will go, and effectively what implications are for policy. So what happens in our IRENA Global Renewables Outlook, which is a deployment pathway, is a roadmap to a sustainable energy system in 2050. So what we did was take this analysis of the base year, 2017, applied the deployment pathways for solar PV, electric vehicles, electrolyzers, etc., and their costs to the the Global Renewable Outlook numbers, which get us to this on track to a sustainable energy system by 2050. So multiplying gigawatts or terawatt hours by the cost differentials to come up with a subsidy value. So the important nuance here is that we're shifting from country estimates, which may be based on an inventory, to, in the future, where policy is unknown, to simply a price gap approach to calculating subsidies. So it's a methodological issue, which we can talk about if you're interested in, but it's a little bit policy wonk territory. And the other important caveat is exclude some infrastructure investments. So I'll move very quickly through this because I want to have time to talk with you at the end. So here we're looking at the direct subsidies in 2017, 2030, and 2050. In the energy transition, they can fall if we rebalance subsidies away from fossil fuels. So the fossil fuels, the gray bar here in 2050, is predominantly not today's subsidy structure to fossil fuels, but subsidies to CCS and industrial processes. What we do need to invest a little bit more in is energy efficiency and the end use sectors, decarbonizing them. So, perhaps contrary to popular wisdom, the energy transition can be achieved without ever ballooning subsidy values. And it's not just a reduction in absolute terms from today's level. Here you can see in the light boxes the reduction that actually comes relative to a reference case scenario. So instead of 25% lower in 2050, we're actually 45% below the reference case. But we need, as I said, to look at the end-use sectors much more. And that is the next part of the transition, because you can see here that the renewable power generation's financial support drops to a very small level by 2050 because of the competitiveness, but we have to ramp up our efforts at decarbonizing the end-use sectors. And this starts to get more expensive because we'll be, by 2050 in some cases, we'll still be in the infancy of deploying the solutions that we need. So they haven't had time to scale and drive down costs. So we're not only rebalancing from fossil fuels to renewables and energy efficiency within the component of energy efficiency and renewables, we're going to be shifting away from needing to support power generation to looking at the end use sectors in much more detail. How do we, how expensive is it? What support is required to decarbonize long distance freight, high temperature process heat, say cement, chemicals, steel, etc. So there's three big takeaways. Subsidies can come down. There's a rebalancing away from fossil fuels, and within energy efficiency and renewables, there'll be a shift or rebalancing away from power generation to transport, industry, and to a lesser extent, stationary applications and buildings. And just to put all of that in context, here we have a chart which is the 2030 and 2050 subsidy levels above the zero, and below that is the savings or the reduced costs from the externalities of fossil fuel combustion. So if you want another metric of how the energy transition is affordable, here it is. So I talked for quite a long time. I will stop there, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Michael, very much for all the insights. So yeah, without any delays, let me go directly to the questions. We will try to take up to 5 questions. So living in the pandemic world, there are naturally a lot of questions addressing that. So I will wrap them all into one question with 2 parts. So to what extent will current COVID pandemic and subsequent economic crisis influence subsidy structures and amounts? And to what extent are subsidies critical in making the energy transition?
Okay. Thank you, Martina, and to all of you for thinking about that. The COVID-19 is having an interesting impact, obviously, in terms of what's going to happen to the energy sector, and we've seen the decline in the oil prices, obviously, and the struggles that some coal mining companies and oil companies have had writing down assets. So So what that does is for fossil fuel subsidies, lower prices mean that there will be lower subsidy values going in. The price gap, if you like, will be given that some of the support mechanisms are based on reducing, prices to certain levels. Then we'll see lower subsidies going into fossil fuels. In contrast, for instance, for biofuels in the transportation sector, that reduction in the benchmark price of the alternative we'll see subsidy values increase. So overall, it will probably result in a reduction in overall subsidies to the energy sector in 2020 because the fossil fuel subsidies are much higher than those to renewables. So they'll come down more than the subsidies to renewables will go up, and there'll be a relatively smaller impact on where most of the renewable financial support goes into the power generation sector, just because of the impact of the marginal cost pricing won't be so heavily influenced in most markets by the changes in oil prices, for instance.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and so in terms of the importance of subsidies or financial support over the energy transition, the reality is that IRENA's analysis is very much taking a holistic approach. So what we see is the need over the energy transition for a 3-pronged approach. You need to support R&D and innovation investments. You need to think about putting a price on carbon or on the local pollutants that cause extra health costs. And you need to, it's also, targeted support to individual technologies in terms of, is important to help drive down those costs to get that dynamic economies of scale being unlocked. So we're seeing that already with solar PV and onshore wind. So we see that benefit, right? But as I spoke about in the presentation, what we see is that, that's great. We've pushed down the cost of solar PV and wind. We see a pathway to decarbonize the power generation sector. Technically, there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of investment that needs to happen before that is, completed. But we can see a pathway. But the end-use sectors, aside from the growth in electric vehicles for light-duty vehicles at this stage, so passenger and small vans, we really haven't started to bend the curve. So we need to address industrial processes, both high temperature and low temperature, where fossil fuels are used and combusted. At the same time, in the building stock, we have to think about heating our homes, cooking, and so on. And here you have in the OECD very low, stock turnover. So it's very challenging. So we need to start doing that now. In non-OECD countries with greater turnover in the building stock, it's a little bit easier and a little bit less costly. But so that's what I was talking about when I, tried to talk about how the rebalancing of subsidies is happening in different places. So, and all of that, of course, while we still have an inadequate price on the externalities of fossil fuels, will improve economic efficiency.
Thank you. Let me take this one. How do you account for indirect subsidies like investment tax credit or tax deductible accelerated depreciation or preferential funding terms?
Yeah, so where those are in play in a country, we usually have access to a country level estimate. Obviously, we don't want to do that ourselves, and we are not, I do not want to become a tax accountant. And I will leave that happily to the experts. So we actually rely on country level estimates. I can tell you for the United States, for instance, that those numbers are actually not as good as you would hope them to be. So there is, they basically have a model to estimate them based on different factors. And it's only 5, 6, 7 years after the fact that they have the detailed individual tax returns compiled to be actually to calculate an actual value. So it's an area where surprisingly the numbers again have a fair amount of uncertainty. But as I said, in our analysis out to 2030 and 2050, what we do is we transition from those country level estimates and specific policies to an idealized subsidy that's required for that deployment, right? So there's an important implication of that is that it doesn't include any administrative costs for the maintenance and rollout of these financial support programs. So the reality is there's going to be a little bit on top, but it's probably 1 or 2%. It also assumes that implicitly then that they're a relatively efficient subsidy, so you don't have to somehow give 20% more just to get the same result in terms of price differential that you wanted. So there are some implicit assumptions there about the efficiency of policy development.
Very interesting, thank you. Let's talk, we got a question asking whether we rank subsidies by effectiveness and efficiency so that administrations can maximize the return obtained from subsidies.
So that wasn't part of the scope of this project, but we have our colleagues in IRENA that look on the policy side of things, and they've looked at that. They haven't, so we've looked at them in terms of how efficient they are in terms of driving deployment and also value for money, right? So the big trend here in power gen at least is the transition from feed-in tariffs to competitive auctions, right, to ensure value for money in terms of the energy transition. And talking about this efficiency that we were just talking about, the implicit efficiency of the policy, those auctions are a good way of trying to, using the market to identify, the lowest cost for the given policy goal. And we've done, IRENA has done a lot of work on that, and in helping our member states understand what good auction design looks like, and what are the trade-offs, right, between kind of efficiency, but also certainty.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions. So what about this one? Could you detail the subsidies for nuclear? Does this include consequential costs for waste management and storage?
Yes, so in the report, you'll find a reference to a paper that was written by Doug Koplow, which was the basis for those calculations. And there's basically a range of areas where it was possible to make some a reasonable estimate. And that includes things like the implicit subsidy from caps on the insurance limits for nuclear. So, you know, around the world, you know, the typical liability, you know, I think the US has the largest liability pool, and it tops out at about $13 billion US, or in that range. And if you compare that obviously to the costs of Fukushima, you know, that pool is obviously not large enough for that kind of accident. And so there's an implicit subsidy there. It's very, you know, there's a small academic community that spends a lot of time looking at that. So there's, I'd recommend that you look at the reference there, and there's a nice little table that he has that summarizes the sources and the range of estimates, both for existing nuclear and new build.
Thank you. Let's maybe wrap up with this one. There are calls to urgently subsidize the growth of the hydrogen economy to enable to scale it rapidly. Do you expect to see hydrogen subsidies growing rapidly?
They will grow rapidly because they're going to grow from a very small base of virtually negligible now. So they will grow rapidly. There is potential, you know, at the moment, most of the support that we're seeing is a specific envelope, right, that will be dedicated to supporting investment. So it's a somewhat different approach at this stage to what we saw with power generation. It remains to be seen how successful that will be, or whether that will require a different approach after this initial push. So I think the hope is that, I think globally, I think it's very useful that a lot of countries are thinking about this and looking at doing it at the same time. Because what we saw with solar and PV was, over the years, different countries kind of came in and out in terms of support, and it meant that we didn't get a coincident peak in support to rapidly drive down costs. And so I think that lack of coordination globally meant that, you know, it took us a bit longer than necessary to really drive down the costs of solar PV and onshore wind. And I think we've seen with offshore wind, for instance, how the maturity of the industry can be pushed much more. You know, when there's a concerted effort at a regional level, you can push down costs a lot faster. So I think it's very encouraging that a lot of countries are looking at hydrogen at the same time. There will definitely be these learning investments, but again, from a policy perspective, you would separate those, if you like, from ongoing subsidies.
Thank you very much, Michael. As much as I would like to go on, the time is up. Thank you very much for sharing insights with us and your experience, and thank you all for sending us your questions. Before saying goodbye, let me finish this very interesting presentation and discussion with a couple of final announcements. So as mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, to be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, there will be a short satisfactory survey which we would like to invite you to complete. Thank you in advance for completing it. It's been very helpful. And then announcement is that we will be taking a short break from webinars, and instead we would like to invite you to our virtual IRENA Innovation Week 2020, which will take place between 5th and 8th of October. It builds on previous edition in 2016 and 18 and regional days in 2019. This year it will focus on different aspects of decarbonizing industry and transport on both the supply and the demand side. There will be high-level opening and closing session. There will be IRENA youth talks, and importantly, there will be 5 technical sessions divided across 4 days to accommodate different time zones. The link to the website is in front of you in the presentation, and the registration will be open this coming Friday. So that is all from us for today. Once again, thank you, Michael, and all of you for joining us today. Goodbye and see you soon.